Hi, welcome to the Poultry Keepers Podcast. I'm Rip Stalvey, and together with Mandolin Royle and John Gunterman, we're your co-hosts for this show, and it's our mission to help you have a happy, healthy, and productive flock. Flock management can't be a one-size-fits-all thing. A single approach never leads to good success for you. We're going to share with you some things to think about and to practice to ensure that your flock is happy, healthy, and productive. Okay, folks, so what's best for your situation? Pastured or coop? John, what's your thought?
I have a pretty decent pasture arrangement, so I can let them out onto a half acre here. But they still have a hard coop and a fenced run that they collapse back to in the winter.
Mandolin, what's your thoughts? Pastured or cooped?
I go for cooped because of our predator load and our weather concerns, plus keeping the birds organized. And I do have the luxury of a barn that came with the property. So instead of several small coops, I'm working out of like 1,600 square foot. And then I still managed to overflow that once I realized what's really needed for effective breeding, that I just kept growing what we were doing inside of that barn until it all made sense. And now it does. So as we get down through this topic, I can explain a little bit more about what's been working. But as far as pasturing, if I want to lose them to coyote and fox and hawks and owls and all that, then I should free range, but I don't want that thing. And just this morning, I realized the cow panels we have around our pig area is the perfect size for a bird to pop through. And I've got a male bird that has found a way out, and he's taken his girls way out into the pig field. And I've got to decide if I'm going to do anything about that or watch that unfold and see how much I can trust my pigs.
And it's crazy because this is one thing we forget about, I think, is that chickens, I think, spend some of their spare time scheming ways to get out of the pen.
Oh, if they can find a way out, they absolutely will.
Yeah, but then they act like they can't get back in, which is always fun, even though they can.
Oh, yeah.
You hold a handful of food on the other side, they know how to get back in.
Sometimes, or they're just going to hover against that fence and run back and forth until you go, okay.
But you're not under electric up there, are you?
No.
Okay. See, that really helps in my situation, but it adds to the infrastructure and the maintenance as well, which we're going to get to.
Well, don't you have to worry about even black bear up where you are?
Oh, sure.
Vermont?
Yeah, the electric, pretty much once you introduce the animals to the electric fence and occasionally refresh it by shutting it off and smearing some peanut butter or some anchovies on one of the hot wires and then turning it back on overnight, nobody's coming back after the first encounter.
You're essentially training your wildlife.
Yes, I'm training them to be in mortal terror of the very hot thing that is surrounding all of my chickens. They're getting a very small dose, but on the most sensitive part of their body, either their nose or their tongue. So it's just, and I've got a smart charger, which just, it gives I've held it for the full 3. It gives a little warning and then a hey, and then a bam. And I've held it to the hey, and it lit me up pretty good.
We have about 3 layers of fencing as our perimeter, and so far we haven't had to electrify it, but I have the stuff hanging around just in case we need it.
Madeline, I follow the same basic practices of you. I wish I was in an area where I could put them out on pasture. I know they would benefit greatly from it, but there's just too many people around. There's just too many birds of prey around. We don't have as many stray dogs as we used to, but there's a lot of stray cats in the neighborhood. And so when my birds are young, I don't want them out where the cats can have access to them either. Well, let's dig into the infrastructure requirement. The first thing I want to talk about is that infrastructure is breed dependent, I think, sometimes. These big, heavy breeds get large, require more space. Birds that are active, I think, do better with more space. Bantams, obviously, they get by with a lot less space, let's face it. And other types of poultry. It's size driven to some extent. And I think one One thing that I did early on was I didn't take into account how many birds I was hatching and how big they would eventually become. And so I suffered crowding issues. And it's an old truism here in poultry world, but dadgum, you never have enough pens.
Never. It's absolutely impossible to have the perfect amount of space. But I think one thing we should talk about is the space requirements for the size of the bird and actually get a little bit specific about it. Because when you hop onto
Yeah.
Google and you ask how much space per hens, you're going to get kicked back a couple of different responses to that. And some of what people seem to take as fact and then repeat it to others to follow is some of the commercial methods. And you might see a laying hen that requires 2 square foot of space. That's more
Yes.
for like your commercial caged sort of environments. And that's usually not what we're after. And I actually go more for like 6 square foot of space per female. And that's just the indoor space. That's not counting for outdoor space. Loosely, there's a lot of information online that says 4 square foot of indoor coop space and 10 square foot of outdoor run space. But that 10 square foot of space outside is not enough to keep grass. As some people do want to keep grass inside of their runs, and to actually have that be a year-round sustainable amount, you actually need something more like 50 square foot per bird if you want to keep it
Yes.
green. So minimum, I would like to say it's the 4 square foot per bird and the 10 square foot outdoor if you do have them outside ranging. But more is always better.
I also think that the more space and just general activity, even if they're not actually foraging, just taking some leaves of hay and sprinkling them around, just keeping them mentally engaged and keeping them from getting bored and trying to find a way out, which they're always going to do, especially if you give them some alfalfa hay, because then they're going to get some really nice nutrients.
One thing that I used to do when I didn't have access to as much room as I did now, I used grazing frames in my pen. I just took some 2x4s and made a little frame. They were probably 2x4 feet dimensions, covered it with a welded wire, and I would sprinkle annual ryegrass inside that grazing frame and water it in, and it would come up and the birds could pick off the tops of it, but they couldn't pull it up by the roots, couldn't scratch it up. So that's one way I provided green feeds for my birds pretty much year round.
Do that too, and you can use a 2x4 to make just a basic wood frame and have it fit 10-20 growing trays. And you can actually start a rotation of fodder trays and use whatever seed you want as far as the
I hadn't thought
rye
about
or
that.
oats or, so you have your frame that sets down on the ground and just pop a new tray in and it'll grow up through that wire covering. And when they've eaten it down, you could swap it out for another one.
Well, we do some microgreen
And-
production for our own health
Yeah.
benefits. And so after I come through and harvest the microgreens, I just take that 10-20 tray like you were describing and bring it out to the chickens and
you
let
can-
the
yeah.
soil and the roots and the plants, and they will just make that thing go away instantly. But, Jeff's not here. He'd say never more than 10% of your diet.
I'm glad you're here to speak for Jeff.
There you go. Keep us straight, John. Keep us straight. I think when it comes to pen construction, one thing, and I don't have as much concern with it as John and Mandolin do. I don't deal with the cold weather. So your pen construction is going to be pretty much climate driven. Now, I don't recommend that anybody build something that's airtight because you got to have ventilation in there because poultry will generate a lot of moisture. And I certainly don't recommend you heat your coops during the winter in most instances. Now, I know some folks up in Alaska wouldn't have birds if they didn't have some sort of heating device, but certainly don't recommend hanging a bunch of those red brooder lamps inside your coop because those things can bust and shatter down. Honestly, more coop fires have resulted from hanging heat lamps during the winter. Got a good friend up fairly close to you, Mandy, but they lost they had hanging heater lamps in their chicken coops, and it was attached to their horse barn, and they lost all their chickens, all their horses, the barn, everything was a total loss because of those heat lamps.
Well, now's
setting
the
a fire.
time of year I see a lot of people jumping into the Facebook groups and asking about heating their coops. And, I
Yes.
give them the dire warnings and say, if you don't believe me, just use the search feature and look for the word fire sometime around February and March, right here on this very group you just asked. And you're going to see the inevitable results. I mean, you may go 30 years and never have a problem, but we get pretty cold here, get down to negative 38. I've registered. I am trying out a heated waterer from Premier One. It's the insulated electric one with the drinker nipples on it. I had been using a heated base and a metal fountain in the winter. That gets costly to run.
Well, it's not just the
And-
fire risk either, because the birds themselves, if you heat one area, but the rest of their space is unheated, like if they want to pop out that door, that temperature difference can shock their system if they're going, like, let's say you're keeping it a nice ambient 38 degrees inside of their coop, but it's about 0 outside. Going in and out of that, chances are they're just going to hover by the heater, and that's going to reduce their activity. It's going to, it just doesn't make sense to heat the coop. And I've never
Well, I should
done it.
clarify that heated fountain was outside the coop. They had to go out for water. No food and water in the coop.
I was going to ask you if
No.
you were heating the water and putting it outside or inside.
It's just going to
because if it's
generate more
inside, it'll
heat and more steam, and then we got to mitigate all that moisture. Otherwise, it's going to be a greater risk to frostbite to the combs and wattles and feet. So it's just, it doesn't make sense. We need ventilation without draft. And that's always a fun balance. And I know my birds will eat snow. I don't have to provide them with water. I do. They will eat snow just fine.
And some breeds are more cold tolerant than others. Loose feathered breeds, they can tolerate a lot more cold than tight feathered breeds like Cornish or Games. And also comb and wattle size plays into it, John. John, I know that's the reason you have Chanticleers, is because you found that the large combs and large wattles don't cut it in real cold freezing temperatures.
Yeah, the wattles take a hammering with the open water feeders. They get wet when they're drinking, and you could see the dieback.
Yeah, from them being able to dip their wattles down into a drinker.
Yeah.
I've seen some pretty serious injuries from the way people have set up their winter water. Like, I've seen people where they use a crock pot because they already have it. It's cheap, it's easy, it'll keep the water melted, but it also provides a pool for the wattles to get dipped into, so that chicken will come up, take a drink, wet the wattles, walk away. And if that air temperature is below freezing, that water that's sitting on those wattles, it's going to cause frostbite right there.
It will.
And then some
It
folks
will.
will say that they need to coat the combs and wattles in Vaseline, but you have to be careful with that too, because if there's water in the ingredients, you're causing the frostbite by doing that. There can be no water in anything that you coat combs and wattles with.
Now, too.
Exactly. You're making the problems worse. You're not actually helping anything.
Yeah. The old practice of, I want to say dubbing, but that's maybe not the correct word.
Dubbing's the right
Is
word.
it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, where you
dubbing's the
trim
right word.
wattles and combs purposefully to protect them.
I haven't had to do that, but I'm prepared to do it if I ever see damage bad enough, because that can accelerate healing. If they do get really bad frostbite, if you go ahead and take care of that, that can help the healing versus waiting it out. Because when they do get frostbite, especially on like large single comb variety males, it'll tank their fertility for months, and you might miss your spring breeding season if they were too badly damaged over winter. I'm always
Exactly.
paranoid about that. So we wrap our pens in plastic if we're anticipating 0 conditions. Like, we had to do that last year because it was getting wind chills to 30 below, which is weird for us in our pocket of Ohio. We normally don't have to deal with that. But just by wrapping in plastic, no heat, not even heated waters, just I added a bale of straw to every pen for a really deep insulated bedding, and everyone was fine. We had no problems. And I do want to mention that I have a heated hatch room, so I can take frozen drinkers, put them in that hatch room, let them thaw. So I have a water drinker rotation where I just grab the frozen one, stick it in the room, and give them a new one. which is tedious and a little more time consuming, but I'm not adding and compounding onto the humidity. So it works.
A warm room in a large
And-
operation is amazing. I do miss that from the college that I was previously at, because we would bring the waterers in the morning, the frozen ones, and just set them over the floor drain, and take the thawed ones and top them off and bring them back out. But you need
That's
2
what we've been
of the
doing now.
3-gallon waterers per pen per day. They got to go up the hill, back down the hill, or, from inside to outside.
I don't have that many steps, thankfully.
Yeah. Well, luckily my
Well, I
infrastructure
think-
has shrunk quite a bit. So it's now more manageable for just one person.
And we're going to touch more on that in a little bit. But one thing I think folks need to consider when they're getting into this is the cost factor. And we were talking before we came on air that we never have enough pens, and it's always an ongoing expansion process. And building materials in this day and time are getting terribly, terribly expensive. So, bear that in mind when you're getting into this thing. Watering systems, we kind of touched on. Down here in the South, I use drinker cups in my pens. Takes about 1 cup for every 4 to 5 birds.
I love those cups. I have the self-filling variety, and I use them on 5-gallon buckets. If we're not in freezing temperatures, that's what I use the rest of the year.
Mhm.
And now my hose
Yes.
is long enough to go pen to pen, so now I don't have to lug the bucket anymore.
I like the design of
But
that
anytime
that you showed us. I think I want to try that in my quail pens, because I haven't been really happy with the design of the drinker that's in there now. And I think that would be more appropriate for the quail.
My birds couldn't figure out the toggle that some of the cups have, that they're supposed to peck that and it brings water out. They just stood there and stared at it. So I had to go automatic self-filling for them, where it's the weight of the cup. If it goes,
That's what
That's
I
the
have.
one.
Yeah,
And
I
I have
like
some that
those a lot.
it's kind of got a little white float that they can peck at, and it'll make water come out. But it's an automatic float adjustment.
Mine is just gravity
Mhm.
takes over when there's so much water in the cup. Kind of falls down and cuts off the water flow
Until
into the
you
cup.
come out one morning and you find a chicken has figured out that it wants to sit in your drinker cup and completely drain your watering system into your catch tray. Yeah. Well, luckily there wasn't a lot of water in the system, and it didn't. And that was something else when I was designing, the catch tray around the brooder was, how much water did I have up here? And do I have the capacity to catch all this without flooding the birds in the process if there is a leak?
Seen some neat bell style drinkers that you can
Mhm.
attach onto like a larger reservoir. But every time I think of coop changes, I have to take the cost of something and multiply it by 12. So when I see something really cool that would help us, that's $30 a pop, I have to take that $30 and times it by 12 and figure out if it's worth the convenience.
Oh, convenience factors are something I know I overlooked when I was first starting out. I had all these little pens scattered all over creation.
Yeah, you put a
And-
1-gallon drinker in each of those, and now you're spending an hour on drinkers every day.
Exactly. So think about that when you're designing coops or your pen spaces. Think about making it convenient for you.
Right. Like I found, luckily,
Because
a 3-gallon drinker is what I can comfortably carry without straining my shoulders and wrists and lift up and in and out of a pen. A 5-gallon drinker is too heavy for me to safely handle without spilling all over myself and possibly causing bodily injury. A 1 gallon's just a waste of time.
And Mandy touched on something that I like to refer to as the multiplier effect. If you've got a breed and you have, say, 3 pens, 1 for breeding and 2 for grow outs, okay? But so many people get multiple breeds. Well, you got to multiply the number of pens by the number of breeds you got, because you can't combine them all. It's not just the pen building. It's like Mandy said. You got to have a waterer for every pen. You got to have feeders for every pen. That stuff adds up
It does.
in a hurry. The voice of experience speaking here. I've been there, done that, and got the T-shirt to prove
A
it.
lot of times,
So-
you mentioned feeders. The type of feeder that you use can have a really big impact on your ease of feeding, but also your overall cost. Some feeders are very
Yes.
wasteful and encourage birds to be wasteful. and some feeders are very efficient.
There's a lot of designs online of the PVC pipe feeders.
Yes.
But if you're not careful on how they access it and the tilt and the angle of the bottom of that, like if you just pop was it like a 45 degree or a 90 degree piece of pipe on the bottom and it's tilted towards the chicken, they can spoon out more than they eat. You can put a whole row of these pipes that'll hold a cumulative 50-pound bag of feed, and they'll have 25 pounds of that feed on the floor in 2 days.
The other thing that I dislike about those little vertical pipe feeders, it doesn't provide adequate space.
It's what, 1 inch per chicken?
Yeah, but what I'm getting at, it doesn't give my big males eat.
Oh, yeah. On single comb varieties, I've seen damage. Like we went through the time to install those into every pen. We put 2 per pen. We had our spacing right. But I did not even account for the mature single comb male being able to have access until I started seeing blood spatter on the feeders from him trying to get his head in there. So we had to go back through and rework everything again.
Somebody said, well, just use bigger pipe.
At these costs. So something I found, construction sites, renovations, get old gutters off of houses that are kind of faded and weather worn. They make great open feeders, but I never put out more than what my birds are going to eat in a day.
Yeah.
I use PVC pipe, but I make a horizontal trough. I cut off about the top third. I use a 4-inch PVC for grow outs, and my adult birds, that's perfect too, for they can get in there, they can eat. The big males can kind of turn their head sideways to get in there. But, I limit feed my adults. I start them off on about 4 ounces per bird per day. And if you're using a 3 or 4 foot long trough, you can sort of scatter that out over the lengths of the trough. If you've got 4 birds, well, you just put in.
Or it just took me a couple of days, and then I'll adjust as things go. I put out, a set amount of feed, and at the end of the day, I see what they leave. And if it's just a little bit of dust down at the bottom, perfect. I sweep that out because I don't want to encourage critters like, chipmunks and possums and things to come eat their food.
And honestly, I've found that my big reds don't need 4 ounces of feed per day.
No,
they're down to about 3 3.25.
And if you let them, they'll candy pick and sort. Yeah. So I very specifically make them finish. They'll give me the stink eye when I walk back, and their feeder's at like 10%, and it's just the dust that they don't want to eat. But I leave them be for another hour and come back, and it'll be pretty darn clean. Yeah. And I always make sure I give them a nice, healthy refill right before bed. I let them candy pick before bed.
Oh, yeah. And I know for folks who kind of feel like they need to keep those feeders full.
It's a disservice.
Well, that ups your feed cost because some of it will get wasted and they will overeat. They'll get fat. And then you'll start having birds die from fatty liver disease or other health problems brought on by carrying all this excess body fat around with them. It affects fertility in your males. It affects egg production in your females, these big fat females. I had barred rocks one time, and they laid really good in their pullet year. And then in their adult year, I got maybe 45, 50% of the egg production I got in their pullet year. And I thought, something's wrong here. But that's when I was full feed. Feeders were full all the time.
Well, now that we've learned about the molt and managing it, we know what it's for.
Makes all the difference in the world.
And how critical it is, yeah.
But I had a couple of them die on me, and so I necropsied them, and they were full of spats in the body cavity.
Where it was wrapped around the liver, wrapped around the heart, wrapped around the gizzard, that fat.
It was everywhere.
It can really get riddled through the inside of them if they're allowed to eat.
Sure. If I'm getting ready to retire a hen, I'll let her go ahead and build up a nice layer of fat because that's schmaltz and it's delicious, but it's not healthy for the hen.
Right before processing, you kind of want it there.
Absolutely.
But if you're trying to have a longer productive life, you don't want it there.
That's not how to do it.
Well, but you don't want it to the point that it's full of fat inside the body cavity. A little bit's fine. Too much, not so much. What about, I ask you guys a loaded question. How much pen space does it take? Like I said, we never have enough.
For which?
And you talked about it a little bit, Manny, But how many square feet do you allow per bird? You talked about that. John, what do you allow?
My hard coop is 4 feet by 8 feet, and I've got 4 roosting bars, 2 at separate levels. So I keep them pretty tight. I like them to generate a little bit of heat in the winter. I use a very deep litter. It's like 2 bales of peat moss down in the bottom, but that's attached to a 10-foot by 30-foot chain link run. And then outside the run, as I said, I have a half acre that they have access to. The run door is almost never closed because I'm lazy and it sticks, and in the winter it gets frozen in place in an open position. Okay. And I am surrounded by electric fence, but in the winter that goes away. I do get a little scared because the birds will go forage in the winter unprotected. It's not until we get down to bare ground and get our first thaw that I can get my electric fence installed back outside.
Oh, that's scary. You're scaring me.
Well, another thing that I've learned is in the dead of winter, my high tunnel, which can be just as simple as a carport, will stay warm enough, and you could loop your electric fence around back and forth inside of this tent and make a little gate. And I've brooded out last winter, a whole lot of chickens in a high tunnel that was otherwise unused in February and March.
If I had a high tunnel for winter grow out, I would never unplug my incubators.
End of February, 1st of March, we're getting down into our negative 30s, and I made an Ohio brooder out of a cardboard box and some insulation, and it worked fantastic. So now
I love those. Mine's kind of, I didn't know what it was because I didn't research it and then build it. But I told my husband, I was like, hey, I need a box that can hold lamps with a door so that chicks can come and go as they please.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, cool, I got you. So he built, it's about 6 foot long, 2 foot deep, 2 foot high. It can hold 2 lamps with a door in the center. So I can put that into our rooster coop, which is like a 9 by 13 insulated coop. Put that Ohio brooder in there, and I can put 100 chicks in there in January.
And they can go underneath the box and get warmth, and they can come out
put
explore.
Their food and water outside of
make
it,
them
so
start
they can
training
hop
them
in that box.
Well, the first couple of days I have it right near the door, so they just have to poke their head out to get at it, but never
like a foot away, and then I start adding distance from there.
Yeah. I love listening to you banter back and forth on this because, man, I'm having flashbacks. You guys are going through and doing some of the same things that I did in my journey.
Bootstrapping. You figure out what works for you, and everybody's infrastructure is different. That's why the one size fits all thing does not work. You got
and there's nothing like screwing it up the first time to figure out how to do it right after that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got an ongoing issue with ermine. Weasels of all kinds. If anybody has any ideas on how to mitigate ermine, because they'll get through an electric fence, and in February and March is when they're predating my chickens, and they do a number.
It's lean pickings for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Out in the wild.
Exactly, and my chickens are about 40 feet. The culvert down at the pond is, 40 feet from my high tunnel.
So that's their little highway to use.
Sometimes I wish they made electric netting that had half-inch squares.
Yeah, that would be expensive.
That would solve a lot of problems. Yeah, it would be. But
Premier One has a shock or not, but it's got a half-inch square inside of the electric, so the chicks can't shock themselves trying to get through, because chicks wriggle right through the electric fence.
Yeah, we talked about pens. We've talked about you got to have feed and water. You got to have some provision to get your birds feed and water for all those. And we talked about the convenience factor for you. Let's talk about how many pens does it take?
How many breeds do you have?
Exactly. You're probably going to need at least 3 pens for every breed. That's at a minimum. I raised large Rhode Island Reds for years. And at one point, I had 12 pens of breeding females. I had anywhere from 100 adult breeding females at one time. That's a lot of chicken. That's a lot of inconvenience factors because they were all lined out in a row. They were 20 feet wide and 50 feet deep.
That's a lot of steps.
That's a lot of steps. Mm-hmm. And I will never do that again.
If somebody wants to be sustainable, have a backyard flock that they can manage and will breed true, and they never, I don't even want to say the out something word. And what's a realistic expectation?
Thank you for joining us this week. And before you go, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you can receive new episodes right when they're released, and they're released every Tuesday. And if you're enjoying this podcast, we'd like to ask you to drop us an email at poultrykeeperspodcast@gmail.com and share your thoughts about the show. So thank you for joining us for this episode of the Poultry Keepers Podcast. We'll see you next week.